know me know I'm a big fan of the military, and I know some of us like to say that we're the PhDs in the CCIM world or the commercial real estate world, but I also like to say that we're special forces officers, folks that, who are out in the field, in the arena, getting it done every day and helping others. And Geoffrey certainly falls into that category. Geoffrey's a fast-track CCIM candidate. He holds the CRE, Counselor of Real Estate designation, and he's definitely one of the Jedis in our industry. I've been saying since this pandemic hit to some of my colleagues that a lot of people are going to need a lot of help and guidance out there. And Charlie and I've talked, and the whole board and we've all talked, and we think that the CCIM community and those affiliated with us are in a perfect position to provide that guidance and help. Early in the pandemic, Geoffrey had mentioned this concept to me, and I thought to myself, we got to get this out there because truly, from the mountains to the sea, we think this can be a tool that all of us need to have in our bag, and we think that it'll be of benefit to you and to some of your clients. So we're thrilled that Geoffrey's here with us today, and thank you all for joining us. And Charlie, I'll turn it back over to you and let you and Geoffrey roll.
Okay. Pete, I'm going to jump in there. Thank you for that warm introduction. Charlie, thank you for the sponsorship. And Jay, I've enjoyed working with you and look forward to working with you going forward. Pete, I think, probably had too much coffee before he got on the air. That was a very eloquent introduction. I have been around for a long time, but for this presentation, I want to reach out and thank Casey Conway, who, as you know, is the chief economist for CCIM. In a presentation to CCIM in early April, he exhorted all of us, we CCIMs, to rethink our skill set for the benefit of the real estate owners, owing to what he in early April saw as a tough time coming in this coronavirus epidemic. And so it's through his encouragement, his exhortation, that I started giving further thought to this notion of rebalance the stack, which is a fancy way of saying help owners raise cash, raise equity to survive coronavirus. That's sort of the takeaway. Rebalance the stack equates to help raise equity to rebalance the stack. And I'll go into a little bit more of that in a moment. At the end of each of the sections, I'm going to pause for a couple minutes or a minute and ask if you have any questions, if you would just place them in the chat box. Okay, next page, please. So as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, I've tried to just introduce a visual to illustrate the challenging time that we're going through. This particular image is just a team cleaning down an office space, but it illustrates the times are different. So back over to the left side of the screen, the rebalance the stack is really a three-way conversation as I view the world. A conversation among the lender. See there at the bottom, the participants are the real estate lender, the real estate owner, which I've dubbed owner borrower, and then the real estate capital provider, the source of new capital provider. And for this concept to work, each one of these participants needs to lean in to make a successful capital raise. And I'll walk through that with each one of the participants: lender, owner, borrower, capital provider. At the bottom of this screen, you'll see the last line is rebalance the stack on the ground team. On the one hand, the purpose of this presentation is to share and illustrate this concept for you all, the members, to use in your day-to-day life. On the other hand, a lot of this information may be new to you. It's secondhand, it's second nature to me. and I want to make myself available to help any of you get started or get through, or just be a coach for you to get through this process. Because what's involved here is not the same as brokering the property, a sale of the property, but it's similar, but a little bit different. And I'm glad to be available to help you in any way I can. But I want to really be clear, I'm not looking to get in front of you. I'm here to help you. Okay, next page, please. In this slide, you can see to the right, we're looking over the shoulder of Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, which I use to illustrate or sort of highlight the lender perspective. So from the lender's point of view, in terms of trying to rebalance the stack and be helpful to the owner, the lender is looking at several things, one of which is regulatory compliance in general and properly margined loans in particular. That's a nice way of saying loan to value, a concept we're all familiar with. So a lender representative, of which I was one for many years, starts to get a little nervous when, in times like this, when real estate values are perceived to go down. Because from the lender's point of view, you have to start forecasting loan loss if that appears on the horizon, and to be in compliance with, say, the Federal Reserve or the OCC. Yet at the same time, lenders are for-profit organizations. They want to preserve income streams, and they want to minimize loan loss reserves. That is to say, as a loan may deteriorate in its debt service coverage, or a tenant may go out, there's a concern on the lender's point of view that it may have to put up more reserves with the regulatory. More reserves means less capital that can be lent out. So the lender, on the one hand, wants to balance income stream with regulatory compliance. Now, what I've just said there is probably 10 years of my life in terms of day-to-day life. I'm going to pause just for a moment to ask if you have any questions. Please push them to the chat box. If you don't, no problem. So I'm just going to wait a couple seconds for questions, and then we'll move on to the next slide. But
Geoffrey, this is Charlie. I'm looking on here and don't see any questions so far. You must be doing great.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Charlie. All right. Paige, can we go next? All right. So this is, again, continuing with the lender. The lender needs to stay on top of its compliance or the regulations that it has to follow. So in return for any requests from the owner for a forbearance, the lender likely will want something as well. That's just nature. It's like two kids in a sandbox, age 5. You don't give up something without getting something back. That's just the way we humans think and work. So if the lender, if the borrower is asking for a loan forbearance, then the lender is probably going to ask for a pay down. So said in other words, okay, I'll help you, Mr. Borrower or Mrs. Borrower, with your loan payment schedule, but in return, you've got to pay down your loan balance. That's typically the way that conversation goes. And then that begs the question from the lender's point of view, if we're going to forbear on your loan payments, in addition to paying down your loan balance, I'm going to want you, Mr. or Mrs. Borrower, to up your reserves. As you may know, it's pretty common with commercial real estate loans to have reserves for future interest payments, repair and maintenance, property taxes, hazard insurance, tenant improvements. So just recap, lender is going to be looking for a pay down in loan balance and an increase in loan reserves in return for a loan forbearance agreement. So that's their side of this equation. Paige, do you mind going to the next? Okay, thank you. All right, so now we're switching into the owner's view of this notion of rebalance the stack. From the owner's point of view, the owner wants to stabilize its property and its portfolio. So likely real estate owners that you're working with have investment interest in more than one property and or investment interest and control in more than one property. So preserving asset values is really important. Preserving income is important. Minimizing losses, and then most of all, preserve the capital, preserve the enterprise. And just working from the bottom up, when I say preserve the enterprise, I've observed way too many times owners being slow to move on a conversation with their lender about rebalancing or even about a forbearance agreement, and in pretty quick order, all of a sudden, a property or many properties have been foreclosed and are lost. So as I see an owner, preserving the enterprise, to fight another day is very, very important. And the way that an owner does that is to reach out to the lender, have a conversation, but be prepared to pay down your loan balance as a means of getting a more favorable loan payment program. So from the lender's point of view, they want the loan paid down to reduce their risk, and they want reserves increased, such as property taxes, hazard insurance, and whatnot. And the owner, from their point of view, they want to live to fight another day and preserve their values. They work too hard to earn the equity to own a particular property. So with these two, you can hopefully you can see the two different points of view. It's not really rocket science, but in the heat of battle, such as we're on right now, it's important to slow down and just take a good look at each person's interests and what they're trying to protect. So I'll take a second break here to see if there are any questions and or to encourage participants to ask questions in the chat box. Okay, Paige. Thank you. And in this slide, we're going to be working backwards from the capital provider's point of view, the equity needs. And as a quick aside, the image to the right is an infrared camera serving as the artificial security guard. That is to say, each person is recognized through infrared film or camera to identify themselves, as opposed to the old school that I became accustomed to, is walk up to the security desk and give them your license and back and forth. The goal now is to kind of go to no touch. So the equities viewpoint, back over to that. So again, we've talked about lender, owner, and now here's the third leg, the equities point of view. There is lots of equity, as you likely know, available and gathered for investment during this terrible time. A fair amount of it is designated in theory for distressed. What I'm speaking to here, though, is short of distressed. I have in mind that there are a lot of good borrowers with good real estate that need cash to survive. So I'm talking about properties that are in good locations, have a good history, but are just being impacted due to no fault of their own by the coronavirus, by tenants who can't pay, for example. So there is equity out there available to invest in those scenarios. And so from their point of view, they've got the equity, but they're looking for, as I say, for good borrowers with a conscience. Sometimes when I get a little cynical, I speak about owners that have a conscience. They do the right thing. There are a fair number, but we don't need to talk about right now, that cut corners. That's not the purpose of this call today. I'm talking about good owners with good real estate. So the capital providers for that profile of owner is looking to make a capital investment that they feel comfortable that they'll get back, that will help the owner get through the hole to the other side of the coronavirus. And these capital providers realize that the purpose of the funds are going to be to pay down the loan, to increase levels of or rebalance reserve levels, that is to say, in this case, probably increase the amount of funds available for future interest payments. Lenders are really keen on that, having prepaid interest in their control, in their escrow, to keep loans current when issues do happen. Now, in this from the equity point of view, the capital provider is going to want to have a right in major decision making. So that is to say, if the owner say 6 months from now, 12 months from now, sees a good opportunity to either refinance or to sell, the equity provider is going to want to have a voice in that decision making. That said, the owner is going to want to have its own voice in that decision-making process, and the two will just have to work it out. That's just going to be a situation-by-situation case. But generally speaking, the equity wants to have a voice, and the owner wants to have a voice. And also in this scenario, the equity provider is not going to pay for overhead costs. They're not going to pay the rental office rent for the equity or for the owner. The owner is going to have to pay his or her own overhead costs. And so I'll just stop there for a second to see if there are any questions, or to ask you to push some to the chat box.
Geoffrey, this is Charlie again. Not to get ahead of myself, but what sort of information or documentation would a capital provider need in order to determine whether to invest? Is there some information that the owner would need to provide back to them?
Sure. The information that would be needed by an equity provider is pretty much the same as a potential buyer of the property. So for those of you who have been involved with property sales brokerage, you're familiar with the book or the OM, the package sales package gets put together. It doesn't have to be as extensive, because some of those packages are very, very long, but the highlights would be last 2 or 3 years, pre-coronavirus operating history, a go forward pro forma for the next 3 or 4 years, with the first 12 months being on a month-by-month basis. And additionally, you would want to provide personal financial information of the principals involved, and sales comps, valuation comps. That would be the heart of the matter.
Geoffrey, this is good.
Terrific.
Sorry, Charlie, is it okay if I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Please do.
Okay. How do I get paid, Jeffrey? If say I've got a client that I'm going to pick on the brewery industry, although I think they've opened back up and I think some of those folks are doing well again, thank goodness. But say I've got a brewery that's in trouble, but they've been solid and they want to keep rolling. They've got good real estate and they need some help. How would I get paid? What documentation would I need to have? Just kind of in that.
Well, sure. So, well, there'd be two ways, Pete, two ways to respond to that. One is a success fee for placing the equity. The owner would probably favor that the most, but that can be a way into the future. That's not a tomorrow thing, payment thing. Probably the most likely would be a consulting fee, much like when listing a property to lease, for example, there's a listing agreement. Well, the equivalent that I would point to would be a consulting agreement between the CCIM member and the owner to account for the time that a CCIM would be put in to help the borrower, the owner, put the package together and then go look for the capital.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, Paige. Thank you. So this is my summary on the capital provider. So the capital provider does have the capital. There is a lot of capital out there. Obviously, they want to invest wisely, just like each one of us wants to invest wisely. But having a good knowledge of the owner is important. That's where you, the CCIM, come in because you know the owner. You can speak for the owner. That's very important for the capital provider. So in essence, that question is this a good guy or a bad guy? And you can imagine how short the conversation is if you don't say it's a good guy or a good person. The capital provider is looking for an exit. How do I get out? How do I get my money back? Is it through a sale? Is it through a refinancing? How do I get out? That sort of defensive posturing, though, is counterbalanced by capital providers wanting to do business, but in such a way to win a relationship for future business. As we all know at this on this call, putting in the time to either broker a piece of real estate for relative to a sale, to underwrite for a loan, it takes a lot of work. And at the end of that process, everybody feels better if there's a good chance of doing repeat business. One and done it's just too hard to do. And I'm not sure it's all that profitable. And so back over to the capital provider needs, again, just as a recap, quality properties to invest in. There too, the CCI can be helpful because you know the submarket. The capital provider may not know the submarket. It may think of Charlotte in a favorable way from the good publicity we've been receiving, but they may not know the submarket, the nuances. And as I said before, being able to speak for the borrower. And then in terms of rate of returns, the equity that I have in mind is at or about 10%. We can argue a little bit more, a little bit less, but with treasuries trading at about 0.7%, 10-year treasuries trading at about 10.7%, a 10% with fees is a pretty good rate of return. And again, the point here is let's not get into debating rate, but just order of magnitude, that 10% is a good number. And then the underwriting, to the extent that you, the CCIM, get into the underwriting with your client, there's an old-timey rule about a concept about prudent man practices. if that's not familiar with you, just think of it in terms of just cautious. Be cautious in your underwriting and provide for an extra margin of safety due to the coronavirus, because the capital provider is going to be thinking that way as well. And in terms of dollars in the marketplace now, 10 million to 15 million and down, 10 to 15 million and down is all the way down to a couple of million, but probably 5 million is a little bit is a floor for capital providers if there's a prospect of some additional business. And then the structure that I have in mind is called preferred equity. Here again, we don't need to get into the pluses and the minus of preferred equity, but just think of it as renting capital, renting equity for the purpose of helping your owner borrower get through coronavirus. Preferred equity, just in short, generally has a fixed accrual rate. That's where the 10% comes in. And then there are some transaction fees that helps bump the overall yield. But it is kind of like renting capital to help you get through this tough time and to the other side of coronavirus. And let me see, then Paige, if you can go to the next page, please. Now there's a lot of information on this page. I don't expect, please don't try and speed read it. I just hold on to it for later. Two things that I want to highlight, or three things I want to highlight to you. If you go down to B, small b like baby, about a third from the bottom. I spoke earlier about the RTS, Rebalance the Stack ground team. Here again, I just want to emphasize, I am available and my associates in Rebalance the Stack, who I'll talk about, disclose in a moment, are available for consultation, phone calls. I answer my phone until 10 o'clock at night. My wife thinks I'm a nut, but that's just the way business gets done. So feel free to reach out. I'll be glad to work with you. I'll be glad to coach with you. As I say, I've done this for so long, it's second nature. And there's such a huge need right now. Now I'm going to go back to Pete Frandano and his comments and him putting his foot up my backsides to put together a presentation for the benefit of CCIM. I'm glad to do that, and I'm glad to help. There is a huge, huge need right now. There are a lot of borrowers, owners out there that need the help, and I almost feel like I'm back to KC Conway. I really feel like it's our duty to reach out and help. And I want you to know I'm glad to be part of that in any way I can to assist you. Rebalance the Stack ground team is a to-be-formed LLC that will be comprised of myself, Pete and his firm, TB Harris and Associates, will may have an interest, and Mecca, the firm where I hang my license, it may have an interest. We're not quite sure yet what the ownership team will look like, but it will definitely be a team that's been through this fire before many times, and we know what to do. And on the one hand, we're going to go into business. We are in business to make money, but on the other hand, there is such a need right now. I want to be helpful as well. I'm not distressed. I'm not looking for distress. I want to be clear about that. I'm looking to help the owners. And then there's one other disclosure I want to make that Garth Dunklin asked me to make. Garth serves as general counsel to North Carolina chapter of CCIM. In rehearsing this presentation with him, his eyes bulged wide open and said, "Geoffrey, you need to disclose to the members that some forms of equity raising can cross security lines, security laws, compliance guidelines. Please share with your CCIM members to be aware of that." And Garth, is available to take any phone calls that you might have. to put a little bit of reality and humor into that particular point, in my rookie year in 1979, raising equity for a firm that's still in business here in Charlotte, I arrogantly said, this investment is so good, it's like a cash cow. And within 24 hours, I was in this gentleman's law office, that is to say, the law firm that counseled the firm that I was working for. And Jay, before the show, you were talking about being ridiculed for some of the things you might have said in your class. I just got reamed up one side of my fanny and down the other. So I'm very, very sensitive about this point about crossing securities guidelines. So just please be careful about that. And I'm now at the point to hand the baton to Jay Taylor, who's going to speak of a hypothetical example to illustrate what I've been speaking about.
Geoffrey, thank you. Appreciate that information, which I hope everybody finds useful. Everybody on the call, I was asked to come in and just do a real quick hypothetical example using our old 101 cash flow model, our T-bar. And not knowing who will be on this call, some of this will be elementary to those of you who are designated or who have already taken 101, but I just wanted to run through the basic cash flow model just to refresh you. So Paige, if you'll just click through, this is our CCIM 101 T-bar, and you all remember the T-bar evaluates time and money, and we've got time on the vertical axis there. That's going to be our holding period. And then on the horizontal, we've got the cash flows, which are made up for initial investment, cash flows from our operations, which can be positive or negative, and then our cash flow from disposition. So that's just the basic 101 T-bar as a refresher for those that have taken the class, and you'll see it a lot if you do take the class. So on the next slide, you'll see that we just came up with a hypothetical example here of a client that bought a $10 million office building using equity and debt. They put $3 million in cash in and borrowed $7 million. And they've promised the investment group a year one cash on cash return of 11.4%, overall internal rate of return over a 4-year holding period of 29%. And we're basing that on a projected exit cap rate of 8%. So when you put those numbers into the T-bar, you get something that looks like this. The time period 0 is our initial investment, so that's negative because that's money that we're putting into the deal, right? And then you see the annual cash flows, a nice stabilized office building with increasing revenues. And then at the end of year 4, Paige, if you'll click ahead, you'll see the sale proceeds because the NOI grew over the time period we owned the building. And so we get a nice sale proceed. And this is an evaluation of just the equity piece of the deal only. So click one more time and you'll see that proves out our 29% internal rate of return. It's a pretty good deal, right? I think most people would be happy there. But if you go ahead to the next slide, we've got a problem. Our anchor tenant at the end of year 2 of our holding period goes bankrupt because of some COVID-related problem. Maybe our anchor tenant was hurt, so I don't know, one of these other companies that's really struggling. And so we got a big problem with the bank. As Geoffrey mentioned earlier, that's where it usually starts. You're not going to be able to make your debt service cover, your loan to value is going to be out of whack. So you need to initiate that conversation with the lender. And to follow along just some rules of thumb that Geoffrey and I talked about, we said, hey, look, we need to have, we need to figure out where we are so we can make some decisions, right? And so if the bank says you're in violation of your covenants of your loan, you're in default, they could force us to sell the building with a big gap and a big vacancy gap and a big drop in NOI. So I wanted to run a T-bar to see what that would look like. So we lost our anchor tenant at the end of year 2. We got down to, now remember, this is the equity only, so we got down to no distributions. We're just covering our debt 1-to-1 in year 3, and we go to sell the building with a much reduced NOI and subsequent valuation. So we only get $589,000 at the disposition of the building under a forced sale situation. And if you click forward one more time, as you can imagine, that totally crushes our internal rate of return. We went from 29, where we're feeling pretty good, now to a negative almost 31%, because we don't even get back the $3 million that we originally invested. That's bad. And so what Geoffrey has just described is a scenario where we try to fix that. So we go to the lender, and the lender says, all right, I'll forbear, I'll work with you if you can bring your loan to value under the current valuation, the depressed valuation, in the line, and we'll work with you to let you restabilize the building. So Paige, if you'll click forward, the next slide will tell us or show us what that might look like. Rough numbers, we'd have to raise $2 million to close that gap in loan to value to get the bank to work with us, and then give us another year to get back to our stabilized NOI. So this T-bar shows the initial $3 million investment, our projected year 1 and year 2 cash flows before we had our problem. Now we've got to put an additional $2 million into the deal to restabilize it. Fortunately, we backfill our anchor tenant in sometime during year 3. So our year 4 NOI comes back and our valuation comes back. And when we calculate for internal rate of return on this group of cash flows, it brings us back up to the 14.48%. So it's not the 29 we had hoped for, but it's definitely not the negative 30, almost 31%. Under this scenario, we get back our capital, we make a return on that capital, and we have, while we've rebalanced the stack, we've bridged through to a stable place. So this is a really simple example. As Geoffrey mentioned, when this happens in the real world, there's any number of permutations this could take. We chose not to separate the old capital and new capital here, but you would probably want to do that. But the idea here was just to illustrate that there's another way. If you have a client that's faced with a tough situation, let's not force the sale if we don't have to. Let's not give the keys back and walk away. Let's see if we can figure out a way to help them bridge through, get to a number at least as a positive return, and not something that's a really negative or catastrophic type situation, which we've unfortunately seen in the past. So with that, I will stop, and please do add questions to the chat box. I do see one up here about 1031, and I'll address that a little bit, and Geoffrey, you can jump in on when I'm done here, but I would say that 1031 question is really a legal and structuring kind of question. I can tell you from firsthand experience, I've been involved in a transaction where we effectively did this, and before we took the equity on, we dropped the properties into new LLCs and a Delaware statutory trust that was compliant with 1031, and we made it work. But it took some fancy tax attorneys to make all that work out. So I think that there's a way to make it happen, but you just have to, again, that's the team that Geoffrey mentioned. If you're going to do this, it's got to be a bit of a Swiss Army knife, and you're going to have different members on the team depending on the specific instance. So that was a great question, Gina. Thank you. And I don't know if there are others. Geoffrey, you may want to add to that.
No, you got it. You nailed it.
So other questions in the chat box?
Yep.
Let's see.
Chris Wanamaker's got one.
The assume the new capital moves into first position after the lender. I would say, Geoffrey, why don't you take that one?
Yes, that's going to be part of the negotiation. The
Right,
new equity coming in is going to want to come out first.
correct.
That's just the way it works. And so then the owner has to balance that against live to fight another day. It's not an arrogant position. It's just that's just the real world.
The new capitals could be in a position of pretty strong leverage in that negotiation. You need to realize that. And I think that's why it's important to understand where you are with your lender and understand what, really how bad it is. I mean, if you're really staring down the barrel of, a negative 30% return and losing a bunch of your equity, that may recalibrate your willingness to negotiate or your client's willingness to negotiate.
Okay.
Other questions?
Geoffrey, this is Charlie Ellis. Yes, you said something earlier that's kind of near and dear to me, and that has to do with compliance. When you start talking about raising cash and equity, I'm curious to know what to say about this activity and, rules and regulations we need to be concerned about.
Well, thank you, Charlie. It's a good question. It's a really good question because it's a sensitive issue. It's not like the securities laws police standing on each corner looking for infractions, but rather there are these security laws and compliance regulations that one has to pay attention to. And so unless you're in the securities business day to day, it's hard to know what's inbounds and out of bounds. And just to make it simple, it probably makes sense either to call me, and I'm glad to help work through and help you, the prospective CCIM, involved, get to a consulting agreement by working with Garth or one of his associates. But here's the reality. Probably nobody's going to know the better about a debt placement if everything goes well. But if the new equity coming in blows up for whatever reason, then that equity provider is going to be looking for somebody to blame. And so that's why it's important to do the homework up front and know the boundaries and have a consulting agreement in place to protect you. I certainly will have one. And again, it's not a matter of right or wrong. It's just protect yourself. And it doesn't take long to get an agreement. It's not brain damage.
Charlie, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, just in terms of, Geoffrey, have you, out there in terms of the lenders, what's going to typically trigger them to, I mean, I know from my own experience, what I've seen trigger them to move, but with so much distress out there, I've talked to some of our, we've got some board members that are bankers, we've got colleagues that are bankers, and I've talked to some of them. But in your mind, what's going to trigger them to move, given the amount of distress out there? One of the questions I posed to one of my banker colleagues is, what are you going to do, with that asset if you move, if everybody's in the same boat? So truly, as we've all discussed, we've never been here before. There was the long war, the Great Recession, but nobody's been here before. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
A good question, Charlie. I think most lenders do not want the property, the collateral back. And obviously most owners don't want to give up the property. So as long as those two observations are true and correct, and each party is working in good faith and doing all that they reasonably can do, no kidding around, stand up, yes sir, no sir approach to a very professional conversation, then it's likely to highly likely something can be worked out. Mindful that part of the working out could be likely will be bringing new equity to the transaction. So said in other words, if an owner borrower is acting in good faith and doing all that he or she can do, a lender is likely to be pretty patient, but not forever, but pretty patient about giving owner borrower time to go get equity. Taking an asset back, a collateral back is, I don't want to say it's a nightmare, but it's fraught with liability for the lender to take it. It can be done, it's done every day, but it's not a walk in the park.
Great.
Geoffrey, this has been outstanding. I can speak as someone who recently had to work with a client who lost property to a lender, but I really applaud you for taking a very creative approach to some challenging problems. We've seen these in the past, of course, over many years, but I can't likely to see so many distress situations coming up in such short order. So thank you for your time as well for contributing to the presentation. It's my understanding that we will have a copy of the slide decks that were presented today available on our website. And I would encourage everyone on the presentation today, all the participants, to reach out to Geoffrey, Pete, or Jay, for that matter, any of our chapter members. Let's have some conversations. I'm always impressed by the totality of our intellectual capital. We've got some really bright people that are part of our chapter, and I think collectively we have the opportunity to really create some powerful teams to create value for our, make a few fees along the way. So with that, we will conclude today's meeting. If you or any of our power partners have some suggestions for future classes or offerings that we might have for our membership, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Great.
Bye. Thank you.